My friends, what good news we've heard today. We are children of God. You and I are God's children, his beloved offspring, fellow heirs with Christ. And it is because of God's love beyond our understanding that this is true. John writes, "Behold, what manner of love the Father hath bestowed upon us, that we should be called the children of God." This is good news about something that has already happened, not something you have to yearn after, strive for, acquire, but a gift already given to you. We are called the children of God, his by adoption. And that image of adoption is one that has strong roots in the biblical narrative, and one that can be a little confusing for us if we come at it only from our modern British perspective. The UK had fewer than 5,000 adoptions last year. By contrast, Japan, a nation that is roughly twice the size and population of the UK, had 81,000 adoptions. The adoption of children in Japan does occur, just as it does over here, but rather more rarely. 98% of those adopted in Japan were adopted as heirs. They were to secure a familial heir. And the vast majority of them are men in their 20s and their 30s. And if we were familiar with that pattern, we'd have a better idea about the language used here in the scriptures, because that too is what took place in the Roman world. In the Roman world, adoptions took place, but it wasn't for compassion for orphans. I'm afraid the Romans weren't terribly hot on that. It was instead people being adopted as young adults. It was about inheritance and about name. Often a man would be adopted to carry on the name of a childless family. The adopted son would sever ties with the old family. They become a whole new person in a new context with a new inheritance and a new name. And it's that is the analogue to the spiritual adoption that we read about today. It's about the past. It's about a clean slate. It's about the relief of any debts that we owe. That is to say, all of the sins we have committed washed clean. It's about the future. It's about the promise of a place with God in his kingdom. It's about our inheritance with the saints. And it's about the present and about progress. We take on God's name right now. We are called to be Christians. And we're called to be disciples, those who learn, those who continue on growing in their faith. The most problematic part of that text that we heard from John is verse 6, where he writes, "Whosoever abideth in him sinneth not." And I suspect that you've had the same experience that I have, which is to say that you know that you didn't suddenly stop sinning the moment you became a Christian, when you were baptized, or when you were confirmed. It's rather hard to put the habit down, I find. There was a time when religious societies and communities would write great lists of sins that you could compare yourself to before you came to confession, particularly popular during the time of the Oxford movement, when Anglo-Catholicism was on the rise. You went through the list, you ticked off all the things that you thought you'd done wrong since your last confession. It was a bit like, do you remember the I Spy series of books, where you'd go around looking for different trees and that kind of thing, and if you tick them all off, you'd get a badge? Well, it was like that, but you weren't meant to tick them all off, and there was no badge. Well, chief among those groups who wrote these lists was the Cowley Fathers, the Society of St. John the Evangelist. They operated first out of what were then the slums in Cowley in Oxford, and more recently from St. Edward's House here in London. And when my previous incumbent was first a priest 40 years ago, he was preparing a young girl for confirmation, and that was the tradition he came from. And so he gave her one of these lists. And she came to him to offer her confession, and she began by saying, "I have false gods in my life that I've given greater attention than God. I've not loved God with my whole heart. I've cursed, I've broken an oath, I've missed Mass on Sunday, I've disobeyed my parents." And the list went on and on and on. And 10 minutes later, there he was, listening obediently to all these terrible things that she'd done. And she finished with a flourish, saying, "I've wasted time at work, I've committed perjury, I have misruled my diocese, and I have been compiled by a Cowley father." Now, some of those sins, that girl probably never went on to commit. But I can promise you that she didn't remain sinless very long, even after the absolution she received at Geoffrey's hand. I'm very helpfully reminded of my sinful nature each Monday morning. Every Monday we gather in the chapel over there to pray together, and we say a responsory that's taken from a part of the book of Proverbs that we heard this morning. It reads, "Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and be not wise in thine own eyes." And sometimes I find myself saying it quite gently to those who are praying with me, and sometimes I find myself saying it with a bit more vigour, really thinking that those people need to hear the fact that they shouldn't be trusting in themselves, but rather in the Lord. Depends how disgruntled I am with them, really. The beautiful thing about it being a responsory is that once I've had my chance of accusing and judging them, they get to say it straight back to me. And it reminds me that I too rely too much on myself and not sufficiently on the Lord. And when I'm reminded so regularly of my sinfulness, it's very difficult to understand what on earth it is that John's trying to get at here when he says, "Whosoever abideth in him sinneth not." It's difficult to understand because it seems to stand in direct contradiction to so much of the biblical witness, and in fact, even to what John says just a couple of chapters earlier in the same letter. We heard those words at the beginning of this service. I read them to you as the introductory sentence. In chapter 1 of the same letter, he writes, "If we say we have no sin, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins, to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. If we say that we have not sinned, we make him a liar, and his word is not in us." What on earth can he mean then? Well, I think the key is that second line that I just read you. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. As the sinful people we are, that's not how the Father sees us any longer. As long as we abide in God, he sees us simply as redeemed people, made perfect through Jesus Christ. That's what it means to be an adopted child of God. We are looked upon in just the same way that God looks upon his own Son, Jesus. The same way God feels about Jesus is the way he feels about us, adopted fully and wholly as fellow heirs with Christ into his family. Let me leave you with this thought. We had baptisms this morning, and I was reminded of the story of Jesus' own baptism, when the heavens break open and God says, "This is my Son, the beloved, in whom I am well pleased." As the adopted children of God, as his sons and daughters, this is what he might say to us: "You are my children, the beloved. In you I am well pleased." Amen.